Hello everybody and welcome to this Tyde Talk of Dead by Daylight's Dark Times. The Dark Times were noted to be the lowest point for Dead by Daylight. This was a time where the game was suffering from a massive plummet of player base, and it seemed like the game would eventually die. Players sought out new games, as other news for those competing games would pop up promising a better experience, such as Friday the 13th, Hide or Die, and last year. It was through these times that the developers slowly mended their issues and brought the game out of its darkness into the success we know it from for the last 2 years of its life. Today we're going to begin exploring all of the changes in history of the game that we can give you an example of what a lot of players went through back when it came out compared to what the players have now. I expect this to be a multi-part series, as there's no conceivable way of summing up all the information in one video that wouldn't exceed 30 minutes, so with that I'll try to cover just general issues or maybe one primary issue at a time, but for sure today we're going to be starting at the beginning of the game. I'll do my best to cover as many changes as I can, though I know I'm not going to get through them all in this video, as I struggled very hard to condense it all down as I continue to dig up more information. Although one of the biggest things was trying to set up the Dark Times video, as we set up several perk videos of Tyde Talk that covered the history and meta of perks. Those are very important in regards to this, as they covered how players would use the perks, and I won't necessarily be covering them in this video. So if you want to catch yourself up, there will be a link to the playlist of all the Tyde Talks down in the description. If you want to watch the rest and catch yourselves up to the meta of each individual perk and how they affected the game back in the Dark Times, do so now, and moving forward we will continue to add more perks we haven't yet covered. June 14th, 2016 would be the release of Dead by Daylight, but this would not be the first time it was playable. A closed beta was available to content creators and the select few who were lucky to get in, as they were able to play the game, giving access to one killer, the Trapper, and the 4 base survivors, Dwight, Jake, Meg, and Claudette. By the time of the release, 2 more killers were introduced, and they'd be known as the Wraith and the Hillbilly. The game at its core is about the same. You work on generators as survivors to power the doors to escape, whereas the killers would then hunt and sacrifice the survivors. However, it's the minor details that drastically change the game and the way they would play it. We can begin with the game's objectives. Though yes, survivors are trying to escape and killers are trying to kill, the method of victory has changed from the beginning. Currently, we have the emblem system, but back then, they simply scored your victory based on the amount of blood points you gathered. Originally, you had the 4 categories of blood points for each side that you might be aware of today. Each category would count up to a maximum of 8,000 blood points. Only 5,000 blood points from each category would actually count towards the overall pip. The additional 3,000 for it would just go into your blood point total for you to spend in your blood web. In order to earn your victory pip, which is the white tally mark that ranks you up, you had to gain 10,000 blood points. If you gained 20,000, you would earn 2 pips instead. Scoring any less than 10,000 would lose you 1 pip from your rank. Essentially, you were ranked on how many points you could score in one game. To save my sanity, I doubt I'll cover all the minor changes to the values of blood points within its history, but they're not too different from the points we gain today. So now that we know what players have to do, let's cover the various changes to gameplay. As the making of this video, we're currently in patch 2.6.4. Back in release in 1.0.0, there are bound to be some massive balance changes that altered the game in a way that changed how it was played. First, let's look around the map and its interactables. One thing you may not see too often, if at all, is the retro jungle gyms. These areas were the original sections survivors had as a defense, and they may, at first glance, seem similar to what we have today, but you'll begin to notice that there is far more clutter in some of this jungle gym. There's nearly 2 pallets at every section, and typically all the windows are open. That won't be the only defensive locations that have changed. Some maps have large buildings that we may be familiar with, but their surroundings have taken a drastic change. Many more windows are open and some pathways are a bit different. Pallet locations have been altered, preventing easy access to windows. The slaughter tree was also massively different, as it had 2 window locations instead of a pallet and a window. Other popular areas that have changed are the school bus and tractors. School bus always has its two windows open, allowing it to have endless looping. You go through one end and the killer tries to follow you around, only for you to jump through the second window and continue the loop until they can no longer catch you. Though it isn't too common that a pallet stands there, there's nothing to stop you from going through. This was often referred to as the magic school bus. The tractor itself isn't too different, as it still has the two windows at the top, but the slide section no longer has the haystack to allow survivors to go back up. This would be a dead end for survivors to fall into without a way back up, therefore it wasn't known to be a very safe location. With that being said, this is one of the primary issues of Dead by Daylight back at release. Use of these locations made it impossible for any killer to really catch any survivor if that survivor made it to the location. These would be known as infinite loops, and they were plentiful. Majority of these loops could be found in the primary buildings for any given map. The Coal Tower itself is a good example. The Coal Tower we know today has a single window available on the bottom and one open door on the second floor, with some pallets around the outside. Back in 1.0.0, Coal Tower would have two open windows near each other on the first floor, and two open doors on the second floor. Essentially, to complete the infinite loop, the survivor would vault through one window or take one of the doors up top, and if the killer were to follow, the survivor would then leap through a secondary window. The killer then enters a loop. They either have to chase the survivor here and suffer their loss, or a survivor runs here and the killer gives up chase only to try to surprise a survivor later, unless it's Trapper who blocks one of the windows. Trying to vault the windows is one of the worst ideas a killer had at the time, because if you think vaulting windows in today's meta is slow, well, you should consider what a killer had to go through back then. Today, our killers vault at 1.5 seconds, so it takes 1.5 seconds to get through the window. Back then, it took 2.7 seconds, and that can feel like forever when just vaulting through a window, trying to catch up to a survivor who takes no more than a heartbeat to leap through it at great speeds. Maps were so bad that I just want to draw your attention to the Wretched Shop map as a second example. I'm sure some of you may be aware of the current building, as it has 3 windows on one side, and 2 of those windows are typically boarded up, and one is always open. Well, back in the day, all 3 of the windows were open at all times, allowing survivors to jump in between, which prevented the killer from hitting them. If a survivor ever got to this location, the killer would have to completely give up chase. Even a trapper could not successfully trap all 3 windows. It was very unfortunate, but this was known to be one of the safest locations for survivors back in the time. Getting this map would cause killers to instantly disconnect as to avoid the heartache. We could go on for a long while talking about all the map differences, but let's also talk a little about the differences for both killers and survivors. We'll start with the survivor side and start with one of the funniest things I failed to notice all this time while playing the game. Back on release, the running animation for survivors was vastly different, as well as the audio. It was almost comical. Knowing how fluid they run and the difference in injured animations is interesting. There were other important mechanic changes as well, but I just thought I'd point this one funny thing out. To start, survivors had no requirement for fast vaults through windows, therefore this made vaulting windows extremely easy since the survivor could stand at the edge and at a moment's notice leap through quickly. Not only that, but they also had the Pellet Vacuum. This was when survivors could be pulled to the other side of the pallet instantly, teleporting them to safety as they dropped the pallet. This caused survivors to be able to make a lot of safe plays around pallets even if it would seem they were in danger. Pallets would also only stun the killer after it was fully dropped. The hitbox for the pallets were also pretty big. It extended well beyond what the pallet looked like, making some very unrealistic stunning hits to killers around the corner. Unfortunately, I couldn't find the footage for it during this Tyde Talk, but if I find it in the future, there's hundreds of videos to sift through. I will be sure to show you what I mean. Finally, the generators were a bit different as well. They actually only required 70 charges to repair, which is 70 seconds. And if you fail a skill check, the generator would come to a complete stop to help disguise your progress. If you didn't start it back up by repairing it again, it just looked like the generator had never been touched. Generators could also be fixed after 5 generators were completed. When the doors are powered, you could still go to the remaining generators and repair them for additional points if you wanted to wait in the game a little longer. Sabotaging hooks at this time was permanent, meaning all hooks except for basement hooks could be destroyed, leaving only the basement for killer to get their sacrifices. Sabotage was important for points as well, as it gave a good amount of boldness. Players would typically stay behind after the doors were powered to break any remaining hooks to get additional points before they left the game. This caused massive problems with killers as they had to wait for the survivors to finish up or be lucky enough to run into them. Survivors were very stealthy and or impossible to catch if they were found, since they could run to the many infinite loops. For killers, they were overall slower in their interactions. As mentioned before, their vaulting was significantly slower, but so was their ability to break pallets, as they clocked in at about 3 seconds. Not only that, but killers also lacked various powers they have today to help with the variety of problems they faced. Bloodlust was not a mechanic, and killers could never gain speed naturally. They would need perks that would be introduced later on. They also did not have the ability to kick generators to damage them. In fact, it was an extremely common strategy for several generators to be set at 99% but never finished, as all players would want to avoid drawing attention to themselves to the best of their ability. Once majority, if not all, gens were 99% complete, then survivors would run around and simply set them all off at once and head to an exit gate, which only took 15 seconds to open instead of the 20 seconds it takes today. There's so many differences, it becomes difficult to cover them all in just one video. Moving forward with the series, I'd like to tackle them all one at a time and cover these major changes more in depth. Speaking of changes, if you were looking for a couple of things I may not have mentioned, the previous Tyde Talks on various perks may have covered the meta for this time a little better. If not, we will be sure to cover it in the future. Be sure to let me know in the comments down below of things you want to hear about. We do have several perks to still make Tyde Talks on, and we will make Tyde Talks on the killers, their history, and their meta. And we can consider that as a good start in covering the dark times of Dead by Daylight. One of the biggest factors of this time was the fact that players were new. They're not as brave or skilled as they would become over time. With that, some players picked up the necessary skills to abuse the loops and abilities granted to them, which would slowly begin to cause the separation within the community. It would become killers versus survivors, as one side would begin to bully the minority as it tried to fit a get good kind of message when it came to the mechanics of the game, when those mechanics were not balanced enough to even give a fair fight to the one side. That being said, let me know what you think of these various changes to the game. Did you get to play back at release? Is it odd to see the maps set up the way they were? And what scares you most about the history of this game? Share your experience in the comments down below. And before we go, I would love to give a shout out to my Patreon supporters. They've made it possible for me to push forward with my work and provide the content I would want, with how YouTube will be demonetizing the extreme violence in video games shortly. Dead by Daylight is unfortunately now going to be labeled that, and if you want to support what I do here, please consider checking out my Patreon page with the link down below. Every dollar helps. Thank you all for watching. We'll be continuing to break down the dark times for the next few Tyde Talks while covering various current hot topics that have been blazing through the community. I should have talked about a lot of these topics, but I've been putting a lot of effort into the dark times, and unfortunately, it's really hard to get both done, so I'm going to do my best to focus and dial down a couple of the hot topics, then release a Dark Times continuation. If you wish to see more, don't forget to subscribe, hit that notification bell, and I'll see you all next time. And as always, good game.